Well, I would start by saying I'm not so concerned about the definition of religion. I don't really care one way or the other whether...
As human beings, we have to learn to live with the fact that whatever our most cherished beliefs are, they're going to lie beyond proof. You know, that is really...
When it comes to evolution, specifically, Alister, you're obviously someone who embraces an evolutionary account of how life came to be and so on. Why for you, presumably it's not an all-encompassing account of what makes humans humans in that sense?
No, I mean, for me, if you like, it's part of the picture, and a welcome part of the picture, but there's an awful lot more that needs to be said about who we are. I think for me, I mean, if I look at Richard Dawkins, I mean, he develops this idea, he calls it universal Darwinism. And really, for me, it's about taking a provisional scientific theory, which is open to correction and development, and actually inflating it into a metaphysical worldview. And I think that does a disservice to Darwin, I have to say, who was always very cautious about these things. I mean, going back to New Atheism, I think for me, there were three real concerns about New Atheism which worried me. One was that I don't mind people attacking religious ideas, that gets a good discussion away, but no, they attacked religious people and said these are fools, they are mentally ill. And you know, that's just not acceptable. I mean, we are very, very sensitive about hate crime these days. We need to be careful about this. They weren't. We also need to be aware that actually they almost seem to have this habit of using intellectual criteria to critique others that they don't use to evaluate their own positions. And really, I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. This idea, if you like, of what you might call epistemic virtue. In other words, you use the same criteria to judge yourself as you use to judge other people. That's a level playing field, and I'm very happy about that. But as I was saying earlier, I do think things are moving on. I think there's a growing realization that what was being presented as something that's very simple and hence right is actually rather more complicated. And that, I think that once we start complexifying things, saying it's not that simple, then actually that's when the really interesting conversations begin. The difficulty is that we're up against a media who are looking for simplistic approaches. And I'm afraid the complex nature of these things just doesn't work at that level.
If I might jump in, I think from where I sit, the problem is that people have a very clear sense of what it is about their perspective that's being excluded by the other side. But if one steps back, it appears to me that each perspective has a kind of validity that was not recognized by the other, but that validity comes along with what I would call a bitter pill. And so the question really is how many of us are ready to recognize that there is a vindication for us and a bitter pill, and that they cannot be taken a la carte. You get them both. And in some sense, what I'm hoping will emerge from discussions like this is a new, I hesitate to say, an adult conversation about the status of these questions and what it implies for us going forward, where really the question of whether or not you can be in the adult conversation is whether you're ready to accept the downside that comes along with your perspective.
Well, let's get into some of the meat of what we're talking about tonight. I wonder if you could maybe give us a brief and hopefully layperson-friendly account of how you imagine religious belief arose in a strictly evolutionary sort of paradigm, Bret.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is what we don't tend to understand when we take a strict classic Darwinian perspective about humans is that human beings are the far end of a continuum. Most creatures have essentially one mode of inheritance, and it is genetic. We have a second mode, and it is cultural. And we are not completely alone. All of the other mammals have a cultural mode, and almost all of the birds have it, but that's a tiny fraction of the biota. But for those creatures that do have this second mode, what you have is a locale where information can be stored in a non-genetic form, and it can be acted upon by the very same kinds of Darwinian forces that shape genes. So in one sense, Dawkins introduced this idea with the concept of memes. It became clear in my conversation with him in October, though, that he didn't take the concept of memes very seriously, that he thought that it was loosely analogous to the genetic Darwinian process, but it didn't have important consequences. What I would argue to you is that we humans have offloaded a large fraction of the adaptive landscape to what I would call the software layer, right? Our genomes do not create a functional creature. We are utterly helpless at birth, and our very long childhoods are a time period in which one can discover and basically self-program the software necessary for life. Now, what we do during that time is we largely pick up the wisdom of our immediate ancestors, who we meet, and then we augment it with things that we discover that they didn't know, which is a very small fraction of what we come to understand. So, if you take that paradigm, what you'll realize is that we get handed a belief system, that individuals whose belief system is a better match for the world have advantages. People whose belief systems are a poorer match for the world have disadvantages, and over time, those belief systems, the narratives that we hand off, will be refined by this process. And so this is so certain once you accept that we have these cultural traits and that better ones will inherently be passed on more often than worse ones. It is so certain that effectively we are talking about a tautology. When we talk about, for example, the narratives that go along with the life of Jesus, how is it possible that those narratives were not shaped by the fact that some versions of the story were more compelling, some versions of the story led to alterations in behavior that led populations to outcompete their rivals? These things effectively have to be true. And so therein lies the explanation for all of the belief systems that we find different populations having on Earth. They are not inherently in competition with each other. They are adaptations to different times and different places, different obstacles. Sometimes a belief system replaces another. Sometimes we have a process analogous to speciation where you'll get, a division, for example, between Catholics and Protestants, where both continue on, adapted to slightly different parameters. And so
humans evolved with two systems, biology and culture. We pass down genes, and we pass down ideas. Ideas spread the same way traits do. The ones that help groups survive stay. The ones that fail disappear. Religion fits that pattern perfectly. People who shared strong beliefs often cooperated better. They trusted each other more. They followed shared rules. That helped their group survive against others. Over time, those belief systems became stronger and more refined. The stories about Jesus followed this process too. The earliest gospel, Mark, is shorter and less dramatic. Later versions add details and stronger claims about divinity. That's what cultural evolution looks like. Stories become more powerful as they spread. Psychology also shows that humans naturally see patterns and intention everywhere. We assume something is behind events. That tendency makes supernatural explanations feel real. Religion works. It stabilizes groups and gives people meaning. But working well does not equal being factually true.
I was going to say, I'll be interested in Alister's response in a moment, but what you've described there, in a sense, is this idea that religious beliefs, like perhaps all beliefs of one kind or another, we receive them because of their value that has been handed down by the evolutionary process, this adaptive sort of, if you like, benefit that it confers on the people who hold it together, perhaps in a community. But in that sense, it doesn't have much to say as to whether those beliefs are true in a kind of objective way. It's more about their usefulness in that way.
Well, I would argue that this is not really an obstacle, that in a sense, so what I've defined as something I call metaphorical truth. A metaphorical truth is a belief that if one acts according to the idea that it is true, one outcompetes somebody who will act according to the fact that it is false.
Give an example of what that might look like.
So in order to maybe make this more concrete and to compel you that I'm talking about something very serious and not a nuance, I'll give you my favorite example, which is a belief of the Moken people of the Andaman Sea. These are the sea gypsies who live effectively their entire lives either on wooden boats or within 100 meters of the shore, who were in the path of the Boxing Day tsunami that hit Indonesia so hard. And it was imagined that because this entire population lived on the sea and on the shore, that they would have been essentially near wiped out by the tsunami. And it turned out not a single member of this community, as far as anyone knows, was injured. The villages were completely leveled, but every single person had been upslope at the point that the tsunami hit. Why? Because they had a belief in something called the Lavoon, which is a spirit of the ancestors, and this spirit of the ancestors apparently becomes hungry periodically to taste human flesh, and it rises up out of the sea and wipes the world clean. That's a metaphorical belief. It saved every member of this population because at the point that the sea receded just prior to the tsunami, the point at which people who had recently moved to the coast in Indonesia walked out into the newly open landscape to see the fish flopping about, the Moken people were running upslope because they knew to be terrified, right? That is a belief. It's not literal. There is no spirit of the ancestors that lives in the sea. What there are tectonic plates that slide violently against each other. But this belief that some ancestral spirit lives in the water and that you can recognize that it's about to come on land because the sea suddenly recedes from you is sufficient. So that would be
That's a really interesting and helpful example. So Alister, a lot to think about and respond to there, but I suppose maybe where I'd like to begin is Bret's general sort of way of looking at the way religious beliefs might have come about through this sort of adaptive value that they have and so on. What's your thought on
well, my thought is this is really interesting, but obviously I'd want to ask Bret for some clarification. I mean, religion's not an empirical notion. It is a cultural notion. What I'm wondering is how one might distinguish, for example, between a religious belief and an ethical belief, both of which might have pro-social outcomes. But it does seem to me that, in effect, in using the word religion, you're almost asking the question, well, what definition of religion are we actually using? Because it's not an empirical notion. And if you look at the history of Western culture, I mean, it is very, very clear our understanding of what religion is has shifted over time. So I'm assuming you're using a sort of generic understanding of what religion is, but it would be good to interrogate that, because one of the things I'm wondering is whether actually a lot of what you're talking about could be morphed into a discussion of ethics. And that to me would be a very interesting point at which to begin the conversation. But I'm also very interested in this idea of a useful fiction, because again, if you study the history of philosophy of science, you are very familiar with this idea. For example, Ernst Mach in the 1890s, atoms are useful fiction. They kind of provide us with a sort of intellectual framework of thinking about things. Now, they're not really there, but this is a useful, heuristic way of thinking about this. Or again, think of Einstein, again, and the photoelectric effect in 1905. He just said, look, it's almost as if light is like a bundle of waves, almost like a particle. And he's very, very careful with his language. He's not saying it is. It's a kind of as if it were. It's a kind of fiction, but actually it's quite a useful fiction. And my interesting point here, which may take us nowhere, but might take us somewhere interesting, is actually history of philosophy of science very often shows that useful fictions become real things. In effect, they solidify. And so that's a very interesting question for me, how one begins to determine whether something actually is a useful fiction. What criteria might one use to do that? And obviously, I would want to say that I fully understand where Bret's coming from. He's raising some very good questions. But there is this issue of whether, in effect, one is making a decision to buy into something because you almost have a moral sense this is right, and I am under a moral obligation to choose what is right. And clearly, that raises questions, but it's in effect about truth not so much as utility, but as this is the way I think things are. And if things are like this, then I need to behave in this way to respond to this. And that seems to me to raise a question of what criteria one might use to evaluate this, to decide whether this is a fiction, whether there might actually be something in it. So it seems to me this is opening up some really interesting questions for further discussion.
Yeah, I mean, plenty again to respond to there, Bret. Where do you want to begin?
Well, I would start by saying I'm not so concerned about the definition of religion. I don't really care one way or the other whether the beliefs that we are talking about fall inside the boundary or outside. My feeling is human beings have beliefs. You're absolutely correct that those beliefs hover somewhere between literal descriptions and useful fictions, and that's the bitter pill for those of us with a scientific materialist perspective is that there's a little bit of faith required to do science as well, and that manifests.
What do you mean by that? Where's, because for many people that'll be an oxymoron,
Yeah.
a contradiction in terms. Surely there's no faith involved in a project like science.
It's funny how often a scientist will tell me that they actually do their work with zero faith, but not possible. Because how do you know, for example, that you are not stark raving mad and that this room is not a fiction created by some part of your brain, right? If that were true, if the universe was something you couldn't observe because you were either comatose and this was some sort of a dream state, or you were the object of some sort of experiment where somebody was piping perceptual information into your jar in order to figure out what you would think in response, then you can't do science because the only thing you have to perceive is what's being piped into your jar, right? So in order to do science, you have to make the assumption, I am real, this is real, I can run experiments on it, I can evaluate what I see, and you can either choose. Are you going to resist any faith at all and spend your entire life on the question, how do I know I exist? Or are you going to accept Descartes' bogus proof, I would argue, and say, well, I'm going to assume that I exist, and having assumed that I exist, I'm going to go on and do useful work, and if it turns out I don't exist or I'm not where I think I am, then no harm, no foul, right? So there is faith there, there has to be, and really the objective, I would argue, for us scientific materialists is to minimize the amount of faith, which sometimes is quite great. If you have a model of the atom that's very crude, an early model of the atom, then there's a lot of kind of interstitial stuff that isn't quite right but is good enough to ask the next question. Eventually, you get to a periodic table that's highly predictive of what happens when you put two atoms together in certain conditions, and so the amount of faith and the amount of metaphorical belief that's in there is very small relative to what I would call factual information, but it never gets to zero. Our models get better.
The tsunami example proves the point. The Moken survived because they had a story about a sea spirit. The spirit was not real. The tectonic plates were. The myth carried survival information, and that's why it lasted. That's how religion spreads. Christianity promises heaven and threatens hell. That shapes behavior. It builds loyalty and cooperation inside a group. Groups like that survive and expand. Evolution favors systems that hold people together. But survival value does not make something factually true. The Gospels were written decades after Jesus. The stories grow more dramatic over time. Paul never even mentions an empty tomb. That's narrative development, not eyewitness reporting. Religion works as cultural software. It adapts. It spreads. That explains its success without proving any supernatural claim.
In a sense, it sounds like you're saying, okay, science does have to, at some level, involve a little bit of faith, and there's these kind of analogies that we have to go with to a certain degree, but we're moving towards a more and more objective picture of reality with the scientific project. Now, when it comes to religion, and Alister, I think, raises the important question of how much that ties in with an ethical question. Do you find us moving towards more and more truth, let's say, about right and wrong, about, what we're supposed to be here for, what the purpose of our existence and the things we do here is for? Are those the kinds of things that also get laid down at some level the more we know about life through the materialistic, process of science?
Well, very often what I find is that we rediscover things that we knew in some sort of metaphorical narrative sense. So, for example, Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning work on how populations can protect a commons is a rediscovery of folk wisdom that protected many commons before anybody knew anything about game theory. So that's very frequently the case, is that there's a good underlying explanation for why some pattern exists. Very often people don't have access to it, and so they have to, well, here's an example from Judeo-Christian theology. If you look up the word filth in the Bible, you'll find that the deity is pretty upset about it, and he has specific rules about where filth can be and shouldn't be. And this is thousands of years before the germ theory of disease. So there's a very good reason that one should, avoid having feces in camp, and it has to do with microbes that we weren't even able to understand until 1859. But thousands of years ahead of time, people had good advice, and it had to do with believing that some deity cared where it was.
And in that sense, even as someone who is a non-believing Jewish person yourself, Bret, you'd say, yes, you can look at why some of those ancient laws in the Old Testament are there. They had a kind of practical purpose, even if it was invested with a sort of spiritual dimension in their eyes. Again, where would you take this, Alister?
Well, this is very, very interesting. Let me just go back one step. This point about faith and science, that's so good. Because, you've mentioned some people. Max Planck, for example, has this very famous quotation that the portals of the temple of science you must have faith written all over them, because you have to have. When you're trying to assess whether it's theory A or theory B, very often it's trying to adjudicate which is the better of two possible theories. I think that is very important. I dislike Richard Dawkins' portrayal of science as, absolutely robust and so on, because at times it is very provisional and tentative, and you have to say, well, it could be this, I'm going to choose that one, but I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm not doing something that's wrong either, because I'm saying I think on balance this is right, but I can't prove that's the right. And that's why I think your bitter pill, which I like that phrase a lot. For me, I think one of the bitter pills all of us have to swallow is this, that actually, as human beings, we have to learn to live with the fact that whatever our most cherished beliefs are, they're going to lie beyond proof. That is really, it's not a new insight. It's there, for example, in Alexander Pope's essay on man, which is, going back to the 17th century. But basically, it is this realization, which I think is very, very important, that you can hold that something is right while being aware you cannot prove it is so. And that, I hope, would encourage a degree of graciousness in our conversations, because, in effect, as I was hinting, I think some of the new atheists think they can prove what they believe. Actually, I think it's a kind of faith. When I moved away from atheism, I think I was always conscious I was giving up on one faith and moving to another. So that's an area of conversation. But I think a really interesting question you're opening up, which I think might be interesting, but we'll see where it takes us, is, we're often told we live in a post-truth generation. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think people think it means that you believe whatever you like. And, what I want to know is how we kind of rein that in a bit and say, look, you can't just believe everything. You have to have reasons for it. Richard Dawkins and I disagree on an awful lot of things, but actually, on this one point, I think he's quite right. You have to be able to show reasons for saying, I think this is right. And that's why I think it's very interesting just to see how you can negotiate this to, in effect, recognize that very often we cannot prove what's right. But we still feel we're entitled to hold these beliefs, but at what point do you have to say, well, actually, that's not good enough to allow you to do that with integrity? For me, that's a really interesting question.
What do you make of that question?
Well, I love this, and the word integrity is great because it also contains the root of integral. And part of the problem with this modern fascination with believe what you like is that people have the sense that they can dine a la carte and that they can adhere to this principle over here and this principle over there. And there's no magic by which that should work. The fact is, a religious tradition is a set that goes together. And we do have reason to believe that that set functions together, or it would not have come through to the present. Nothing guarantees that going forward from here in the 21st century that it's still relevant, may even be very dangerous. But we do know that at some point in the past, those ideas fit together. But if you want to pick one from here and one from there, the chances that you come up with a coherent set of beliefs and principles is pretty close to zero, which begins to raise questions, which is, if you're going to adhere to a kind of faith, are you not then obligated to take on all of the edicts that come along with it? And what do we do if some of those, or in some cases all of them, are now in conflict with the realities of the modern world? And what do we do about the fact that different traditions will be absolutely incompatible in a way that makes it difficult for us to get along in civilization? This is really the pickle, and it's, I think if there's a bitter pill for all of us, it is that once we come to realize that there is wisdom in these traditions, we also have to come to realize that it is not one wisdom and it won't all fit together easily and work itself out.
Listen to what Alister just admitted. He said our most cherished beliefs lie beyond proof. That's the problem. If you can't prove it, and you admit it sits outside evidence, then you're asking people to organize their lives around something you cannot verify. Then, he says, atheism is just another faith. That's false equivalence. Science works on evidence, correction, and testing. Religion works on authority and tradition. When it comes to ethics, we don't need divine commands to explain morality. Cooperation, fairness, and reciprocity show up in social species long before Christianity. Evolutionary biology and game theory explain why fairness increases survival. Empathy has neurological roots. Mirror neurons fire when we see others suffer. Morality grows from social survival, not from Sinai. And the Bible itself is not ethically consistent. It regulates slavery. It commands genocide in Deuteronomy 20. It shifts over centuries. That's cultural development, not eternal moral truth. Religion functions like inherited folklore. It guides behavior. It binds groups. It encodes old wisdom in supernatural language. But that does not make it divinely true. So here's the real question. Do you believe religion is a fictional framework that gives people hope and guidance, or do you believe it reflects ultimate reality? Comment below and let me know. And don't forget to like and subscribe.